read this before our next meeting, and he's the founder of the Modern Meeting Standard. We're going to have a half-an-hour Q&A session talking about how you can transform your organization's meetings. So, Al, welcome, and Shane, welcome as well.
Thank you. Hi, guys. Glad to be here.
And, Al, I just want to sort of kick it off with kind of a general question. When I think I first heard about you and your business through the Domino Project, and I was just loved the focus of the business because meetings, as you know, have just for so many people have this real like visceral reaction. Like there are so many people that just can't stand meetings, that don't go to them, and there are people that seem to spend their whole day in meetings and they just hate it so much. So I just loved how that was like your angle and your focus. Can you kind of give a little sort of background on how you came up with the idea and sort of your experience with it a few years in?
Sure. Yeah, I used to be a advisor for Ernst & Young. So I used to be a consultant essentially, and I would go to client sites of different Fortune 500 organizations every single day, and I was just amazed at how many meetings there were at every single client site. Not only were there a lot of meetings, there were all bad meetings, and I used to, the common metaphor is fish don't know they're in water, but I did. I mean, I knew that there was something noticeably wrong with these meetings, that they weren't getting anything done, but to everybody else it was just like breathing. So I thought to myself, there's got to be a solution to this problem that a lot of people don't even know exists, and that kind of got me into this obsession of trying to figure out what the problem, what the solution was.
Yeah, and I should say I watched your talk at Google New York on YouTube a few days ago, and I loved how you talked about meetings as sort of this, I forget the term you used, but this kind of has like cascading effects. When you fix sort of your meeting culture, all this other great stuff happens as well. Can you talk about that? I think you had like 3 points of sort of, or 3 tips on sort of how you can change your meeting culture and get those kind of cascading effects.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably what separates my work from some other experts that talk about meetings who do a great job as well is that I really see meetings as a culture problem, right? I mean, there are the meetings themselves, and then there are the culture where the meetings arise from, and the culture that meetings produce. And I think, I've studied culture for some time now, and I've really, one of the things that's so profound about culture is how incredibly influential it is to our behavior. Right, we all know this implicitly. If you go into an organization that's got a culture of being on time, like for example, I mean, I don't have any good examples for you, but if you are adopted into a culture that is very good about being on time versus a culture that's not good about being on time, that means the difference between you being on time or not being on time, just based on the culture that's around you. So the fundamental question is, how do you change a culture, and specifically a meeting culture? And the name is escaping me now. The guy who wrote Power of Habit, who's a fantastic author who I love, and I can't remember his name right now.
The Power of Habit, is that starts with a D, right?
Yes. Charles Duhigg.
Duhigg, yes.
He's got a great book on understanding habits, but he also understands that habits are the building block of culture. And he had this great section in his book that was called The Power of Keystone Habits, which is essentially the idea that there are certain habits that have disproportionate impact in a culture, right? So if you change those habits, it creates cascading effects that happens to change the culture in total. He has this great story about Alcoa and how they wanted to transform their entire culture and really reinvigorate the business. And what they did was they focused on worker safety. Now, anybody who wants to change the bottom line of their company thinks changing worker safety is crazy, but because worker safety is a keystone habit, it actually had the effect of changing the culture. When you change worker safety, the management and staff have to pay attention to detail, and they have to be innovative, and they have to know how to communicate with each other. So that's a really profound kind of insight. So when I think about meetings and changing meeting cultures, I think there are several keystone habits. I'll just talk about one, which is meeting institutionalization. So one of the things that happens in meetings is they become institutionalized. You have a meeting that happens every single day at 10 a.m. in the morning, status meeting, and what happens is that meeting becomes less effective because we forget what the purpose of the meeting actually is.
Mm.
Instead of being a meeting as a tool to solve the problem, the meeting becomes a receptacle just to discuss any problem. So we end up starting the day saying, okay, what are we supposed to talk about today? What's the meeting for? And so one of the habits that I talk about, which is really simple and it seems gimmicky, but it works, is if for any standing regular meeting, instead of actually leaving it on the calendar, it's actually canceled by default. So all regular meetings are tentative. So if you think about any regular standing meeting, if you make it tentative and make it so that every single instance somebody has to raise their hand and say, here's why we need to have this meeting this week or this today, that's a keystone habit that can start to destroy the meeting institutionalization. So that's an example of just one kind of tiny habit that could have a disproportionate impact on the culture.
Yeah, that's a really great point. What I hear you saying is you want to put the incentives in the right place, right? So it's like, I think at some point it might have been inspired by something you wrote, but I wrote this post at some point called like the late meeting death spiral, and it was like, you've got a few people who show up late for meetings, and then the people who show up on time are penalized, and then over time those people start showing up late, and it just keeps going and going and going, and you have this like atrophying effect. And the same thing with meetings, where you've got people putting meetings on the calendar for good reason because they want to reserve that time next week or the week after, and then all of a sudden everybody's calendar's filled up with meetings that they may or may not need, and it's like you've got this stuff, this, like you said, this institutionalization. It's like, how do we sort of flip the incentives to make it not the default to have that meeting, but to have to say, okay, this is why we're meeting.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Brian. I think time is also a keystone habit. If you can successfully, and it's so hard for organizations, get meetings to start on time and everybody there in their seats, you will. It's dramatic how much productivity goes up inside the meeting and how things change inside of the culture. Because if you think about it, one of the biggest gripes that people have with meetings is that people don't feel respected. Their manager, their boss comes in 10 minutes late, and they're already not engaged because they feel resentful that what is it that my time is not as valuable as yours. So again, these little things can produce disproportionate impact, and that's kind of what I'm interested in.
Yeah. And Shane, over to you. So you're in the kind of software business, and you make software for people who are holding meetings. Are you seeing the same things in your space where you've got these kind of habits that we want to reverse or we want to sort of flip? And how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, what's fascinating about meetings is how common the problem is and how consistent it is. I mean, regardless of what type of company I work with, you just see the same things over and over again. The things you mentioned, meetings starting late, the culture of blocking out people's calendars and kind of owning their time. And what's interesting about it is, when I talk to people, everyone says that people are your most important asset. And you talk to these organizations, yet they squander up to a third of people's time in bad meetings. So that challenge that these executives have is saying, well, if you really value your people so much, why do you put them through this? Why do you stick them in this? And often, why do you instigate that? So it is interesting. I think I'd love to hear from Al's perspective too on just how leadership in these organizations kind of capitulate on this and just assume, that's the way it's going to be, and it's not. It's often driven by excessive status requests and just this assumption that everyone has to be in the room to make a decision. All these problems, and it starts with, I think, a lack of respect for people's time and a lack of respect for their contribution. Because no one goes home at the end of the day on a Friday and says, "Man, wish I had more meetings this week. I was, just really so productive," and they just really feel truly drained by it, intellectually, emotionally, just devalued, and it's frustrating for me. It's a lot of reason why I do what I do, but love to hear Al's perspective on just how leadership in organizations can actually understand how they're wasting their most valuable asset in people's times and stuck in meetings.
That's a great question, Shane. And when you think about this current meeting system, who benefits? Who benefits from a broken meeting system, unfortunately, is the leadership. And I'll give you an example. I mean, when you think about a status meeting that is called by some type of senior manager, where they have an announcement to make, and they could have sent a memo, which would have taken them 5 hours to write a really well-crafted memo, or they can call a meeting in which they hold 8 people hostage in a room for an hour, and that collectively takes up 8 hours of other people's time, but it only takes up 1 hour for themselves. So one of the things that we have to confront is, first of all, I'm a big fan of leadership. I work with leadership all the time. People are good people, and they value and respect their employees, but I think sometimes they need to be confronted with that reality, and that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, really trying to get them to understand the effects of what they're doing. Because the effects are often invisible. You know, you don't see the time being wasted on other people's calendars. You see it from your perspective, but by confronting people with the reality of how this is impacting people, you really get a different understanding of, wow, a meeting really is a weapon of mass interruption. And if I use it, then I must have exhausted all other options, because otherwise it's kind of reckless not to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you mentioned too the people showing up late to meetings, and I think what I've often found too is that because they're running short on time, they end up not getting to the core reason they were there to begin with, and so they just reschedule a follow-up. It's always, well, we didn't get to it today, so we'll need to have a follow-up meeting, and they're no more prepared for the next meeting than they were for this one. So it's probably the same as the January 1st coming every year, and the resolution of, well, we're going to lose weight this year, but the next year comes and you're no more prepared to do it that year than you were before. And on a micro basis, that seems to be happening in organizations all the time. And again, I guess goes back to habits, because it's just a bad habit that organizations get into, and they get stuck in that rut.
Yeah, I mean, meetings have become the default stalling tactic for important decisions, right? I mean, they are a symptom, but they're also the cause, because when you have a decision that you need to make, but it's a tough decision, which most big decisions are, one of the easy outs you have is to call a meeting, right? Because one, you have more time to make the decision. Two, you have more people on the hook to help you or to diffuse the responsibility. And three, you look productive doing it, right? I mean, in all organizations, or in a lot of organizations, there's just this implicit rule, which is whoever holds the most meetings wins. You know, if you hold the most meetings, you are clearly the most important person. You're the busiest person. You're the most productive person. So let's promote him. So there's some pretty perverse incentives, I think, that we have that are cultural, and I think a lot of companies are starting to realize that. They're starting to change, and I think it works when you start to realize how kind of dangerous meetings can be.
Mm-hmm.
Hey Al, I know one of the things that I hear people saying is, I'm an individual contributor at my organization, or I'm a middle manager at my organization, and they feel like this culture is sort of coming down from above. Mm-hmm. And obviously, I'd assume that the organizations that bring you in have that buy-in from above to sort of make change. But what can somebody do, who maybe is, feels, they're sort of the lone wolf in the organization, they're trying to make change, or there's a small group of people who are trying to make change and don't necessarily have that formal authority to do it. Any thoughts on how people can make change that way?
Yes. I mean, there are two approaches, right? There's a downstream approach and there's a upstream approach to big changes, right? Upstream approach is when it's kind of a grassroots movement where you get colleagues involved, you get it to spread, just like any movement, so that way eventually it kind of changes the entire organization. The other way is an upstream or a downstream approach where you get management involved to change policy and to dictate certain changes from the top. And we need to do both, okay? One is harder than the other. An upstream approach where you do grassroots takes a lot longer, it's slower, and it can be effective, and it's much easier to start. But the reality is there's so many social forces at play here that if you really want to have long-lasting, meaningful change across the organization, you have to take the downstream approach too, where you lobby management and leadership that this needs to change from a policy level. So one of the most immediate things you can do, and I tell people this all the time, is change the meetings around you. You know, you attend meetings, you may or may not lead meetings. Start with those. You know, start by enrolling people, you know, your bosses, colleagues, into some of these ideas that, hey, maybe we need to start taking a different look on how we deal with meetings. And if you can do that, well, the great thing about meetings are they're the world's best marketing tool, because you can't have a meeting without other people. So if you can change the meeting, well, you're going to touch other people, and you could possibly inspire other people to do the same for their own meetings, you know? And so it could have a viral effect. So that's the place to start. But at the same time, I think it's really important that you develop a channel to management and leadership to get them to understand that this is something that needs to change organization-wide. So if you can take that parallel track, which is admittedly not formidable, then that's kind of the most effective way to get change to happen.
Yeah, and Shane, I want to give you a chance to jump in too, but Al, real quick, in terms of somebody kind of making that pitch to senior leadership in terms of why meeting culture needs to change, what are sort of the bullet points that you would give?
Well, I think that you have to try to understand what leadership cares about. You know, and different leadership teams care about different things. So the first thing you have to do is understand what they want. I mean, it turns out a lot of leadership teams care about financial numbers. They care about the bottom line. So one of the things you can do, which other companies have done, or at least I've asked other companies to do, and they've done this, is create a meeting survey. You know, get a lot of people, as many as you can, to fill out a survey to indicate how many meetings they attend on a weekly basis, how many hours they spend, planning, how many hours they spend transitioning. You know, try to calculate the total number of hours that people are spending on meetings, and identify what are how productive those meetings are. You know, indicate or have measures to try to produce an understanding of how unproductive these things are, and also indicate stories. One of the most things you could do is indicate stories. You know, like, tell me your meeting horror stories, or tell me your meeting success stories, because stories are really what change people. In fact, if you really want to be bold, get a camera and go to people and actually have them communicate their meeting horror stories, you know, through video, because that is extremely compelling. Compile that information and then give it to your leadership team in a non-threatening way, which I admit is hard, but do it. And that is the way that you can start to get people to understand that, listen, this could be a problem from a culture standpoint. I mean, remember, people purposely, and not intentionally, but they do subconsciously try to avoid or hide things away from themselves that they don't want to know. It's for example, it's people who don't want to step on the weight scale because they don't want to know that maybe I need to lose a couple of pounds. I think it's the role of people in the organization to present this information to leadership so they know what the problem is and they know how bad the problem is, and that's the first step in kind of producing change.
Yeah, those are great ideas, especially just the concept of like taking a step back and thinking about what's important to your leadership. You know what I mean? Like, meet them where they are, to give them not an argument, but give them a story that resonates with them, and you have to know where they're coming from first. You know, it's like just saying that our meetings are terrible probably isn't going to do it. Like, what's their bottom line, whether it's financial or otherwise? Yeah, that's good advice. Shane, back to you. Any other thoughts? We've got a few minutes left, so I want to give you a chance to jump in again.
Yeah, just share one story to add on to what Al was talking about. I knew one person in a large organization I'd worked with who, you talk about what can a person do who's rank and file, if you will, and she would start the meetings on time all the time, and when the manager would walk in late and would ask her, well, catch me up on where we are, she would tell the manager, I'll have to do that afterwards, right in the middle of an important topic, and would just show that, hey, our time is important and we're already moving here. We're already doing something. So if you're going to show up late, you got to wait. You can't interrupt this great thought. So that was just sort of what empowered person can do. But I think the last question, if there's time for it, was just to maybe for Al, if there are certain industries you're seeing that are doing a better job of this, or maybe geographies. I mean, is the U.S. worse than other parts of the world, or who's leading the pack here and changing this cultural issue?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, anecdotally, I would say that the U.S. is fairly bad at this, but there's a lot of like collectivist cultures, for example, in Asia, where there's more power distance, where it's kind of hard to be able to voice concerns and objectives that have some problem. I haven't done a lot of cross-cultural research on the meeting problem across organizations, but the book has been translated into 5 different languages like Indian and Polish. So you get a sense that the meeting problem for sure is going on in other organizations. But I think that it's amazing that this goes across industries, it goes across countries. I mean, this is a fundamental problem with human nature, I think, human behavior. I mean, people are terrified of certain things. One of them is decisions, and so they use meeting as a convenient tool to dissipate that fear. So it's something that you see as a pattern in so many different organizations that cuts across all different kinds of stereotypes.
Good.
So we've got to wrap up in about a minute, but Al, one thing I wanted to just give you a chance, if you have anything to share in terms of your first book, or your book that you wrote was Read This Before Our Next Meeting. You also have a blog that you write on, and I know your blog is one of my favorites, so I noticed that recently you've been writing a little bit less, and I think that's for gearing up for something else. So I don't know if you want to share sort of what you're thinking about, or kind of what you're working on.
Yes, I'm working on a new book, and it was actually just acquired by HarperCollins Business, and it's not going to come out till 2015, so I haven't been talking a lot about it, but it's basically, the premise of the book is, and I can't tell the title yet, but the premise of the book is it's about persuadability. So there's a million books on how to be more persuasive, right? I mean, bookshelves are full of them. But if you look at our culture right now, we don't have a problem being persuasive. We're actually pretty good at that as a culture. What we're really bad at is being persuadable. Nobody actually wants to change their mind anymore. In arguments, in meetings, people are trying to persuade everybody else, but they're not trying to persuade themselves, or they're not trying to be persuaded. So this is a book, kind of on one of the first books, I think, on not how to be persuasive, but how to be persuadable in business and politics, in relationships. Because I think in business, not only is being persuadable the right thing to do, right? Being open-minded, humble, and intellectually honest, it's actually a competitive advantage in a world that's changing faster than ever. So I'm working very hard on that book right now, and I'm excited about it, but it's not going to come out until 2015. That
sounds fantastic, though. That's a great place to end, the idea of being persuadable, listening, being intellectually honest, and open to new ideas. That's a great place to end. So thanks, guys, so much. This has been a great Q&A session. Thank you, Al, so much for your time, and Shane, thanks for donating and joining the session.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks, Brian.
Okay. See you guys, and you guys can hang up now. I can't stop the session, but you guys can hang up.
All right, we'll see you later.
Thanks, guys.